Hello everyone, enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
The mailman notices a large stain on the elderly woman's leg and calls the police. Daniel, as usual, stepped into the narrow alley leading to Mrs. Catherine's house. He came here every day to deliver mail, but today, something felt off. Daniel stopped in front of her yard, his eyes sweeping over the surroundings, and a heavy feeling began to rise within him. Mrs. Catherine's front yard, usually vibrant and meticulously maintained with blooming flowers and lush green grass, now looked as though it had been abandoned for days. The grass was overgrown, dry leaves scattered everywhere, covering the path, and the flowers that once bloomed were now withered. The crisp morning air suddenly felt stifling. Daniel stood there, trying to suppress the anxiety welling up inside him. Normally, every time Daniel arrived, Mrs. Catherine would be standing by the door, greeting him warmly and taking the mail with a kind smile. But today, there was no sign of her waiting. The door remained shut, the curtains tightly drawn, casting a chillingly eerie vibe. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then decided to knock on the door. The knock echoed dryly in the silent air. Daniel stood there, listening intently for any sound from inside the house. But nothing. No footsteps, no response from Mrs. Catherine. Daniel knocked again, louder this time, a vague fear rising in his heart. After a few minutes of silence, Daniel looked over at the neighboring house and noticed Mrs. Rose, Mrs. Catherine's neighbor, watering her plants. He quickly walked over and asked, "Mrs. Rose, have you seen Mrs. Catherine? I came to deliver mail today, but she didn't come out like she usually does." Mrs. Rose furrowed her brow, then shook her head. "Strange. I haven't seen her for the past few days either. Usually, Mrs. Catherine comes outside early to water her plants, but she hasn't been around lately. I thought maybe she had family visiting." Hearing this made Daniel even more worried. He sensed that something was wrong, but he didn't know what to do next. After a moment of thought, he decided to try knocking on the door one more time, this time longer and harder. Just as Daniel was about to give up and turn away, the door to Mrs. Catherine's house slowly opened, but it wasn't with the familiar smile. Standing before Daniel was a completely different Mrs. Catherine. The woman who once seemed so full of life now looked frail and worn out. Her hair was disheveled, tangled as though it hadn't been brushed in days. Her eyes were dull, dark circles deeply etched on her pale face. What shocked Daniel the most was the dirty clothes she was wearing. There were strange stains and blood marks on her pants that she seemed entirely unaware of. "Mrs. Catherine, are you all right?" Daniel stammered, unable to tear his gaze away from the unusual marks on her clothing. "Ah. I'm fine, just a bit tired lately," she replied, her voice weak, as if every word drained her energy. Daniel glanced inside the house. The room that was once spotless and tidy now looked messy, littered with trash and scattered belongings. Especially concerning were a few medical devices that Daniel didn't recognize, abandoned on the chairs and floor. Something was very wrong. Mrs. Catherine's condition was clearly not fine, no matter how hard she tried to hide it. "Are you sure you're okay, Mrs. Catherine? Do you need any help?" Daniel tried to keep his voice calm, but his worry was evident in his eyes. "No, there's no need. Thank you," she replied, but her voice was shaky, and her thin hand clung to the door as if afraid it might fall closed at any moment. Daniel could see that Mrs. Catherine didn't want to bother anyone, didn't want to reveal her true condition. But he couldn't shake the growing sense of worry inside him. He stood there, looking at her for a long time, then reluctantly turned to leave. His heart felt heavy as he walked away from her house. As he walked back down the alley, Daniel couldn't shake the image of the frail, worn-out Mrs. Catherine standing at the door. He didn't know what to do next, but the guilt and worry clung to him like an invisible shadow. It was clear that Mrs. Catherine wasn't okay, but Daniel didn't have the courage to face that reality. The image of her standing behind the thin wooden door, looking so frail, lingered in his mind. Unlike other days, he couldn't focus on his work, his heart weighed down. The image of her tired, shadowed eyes, the dry blood stains on her clothes, and the messy house kept haunting him. He couldn't understand why Mrs. Catherine, who was always cheerful and attentive, had fallen into such a state. The change was too sudden and too strange. All afternoon, Daniel kept fumbling with his work, trying to push away the disturbing thoughts but to no avail. He wondered. What happened to Mrs. Catherine? Is she really all right? If she needs help, can I just ignore it? Daniel couldn't find an answer, and the unease in his heart grew. At the end of the day, as he finished his work, Daniel headed home, but his steps weren't as light as usual. He passed by the small alley where Mrs. Catherine lived, his heart full of turmoil. Unable to bear the worry any longer, he stopped in front of her gate once more. The rusty fence, the gate slightly ajar as if waiting for help, and the dismal sight inside remained unchanged. Daniel stood there, looking at the house, torn between knocking again or just walking away. I can't just stand here, Daniel muttered to himself. Summoning all his courage, he decided to knock. This time, the sound of his knocking echoed through the cold silence, filling Daniel with an overwhelming sense of dread. He listened, hoping she would open the door as before, but there was still no response. Suddenly, from behind the house, there was a faint sound, as if something had fallen. Daniel's heart raced. He cautiously walked around to the back, peering through the dusty windows. Through the murky glass, Daniel saw Mrs. Catherine huddled on a small stool, her head resting in her hands. Beside her were scattered medicine bottles, some empty vials rolling on the floor. Mrs. Catherine. Daniel called out, trying to keep his voice steady. But she didn't respond, just sat there quietly, like a living statue, her shoulders trembling. Daniel could see the despair and loneliness enveloping her. He hurriedly knocked on the window, hoping she would respond. She moved slightly, turning to look at him through the window. Her eyes were vacant, no longer bright like they once were, and her face showed infinite fatigue. Are you okay? Daniel asked, his worry clear in his voice. But Mrs. Catherine only looked at him blankly, without a word. Daniel felt his heart tighten, as if he were watching something fade away before his eyes, powerless to stop it. After a few moments, Mrs. Catherine stood up and slowly shuffled toward the back door. Daniel quickly ran to the front door, hoping she would come out so he could help her. The door opened again, and she stood there, still the familiar figure but heartbreakingly distant. She didn't say anything else, just looked at Daniel with heavy eyes, drained of all life. I told you, I'm fine, she whispered, her voice nearly drowned out by the wind. Daniel didn't know what to say. His worry and awkwardness showed in every movement, but Mrs. Catherine continued to refuse any help. If you need anything, please call me. I'll come back any time, Daniel said, his heart aching with helplessness. He gave her one last long, compassionate look before she closed the door again, slowly disappearing behind the thick, gloomy curtain. Leaving Mrs. Catherine's house, Daniel felt a weight pressing down on him, as though he had witnessed something unforgettable. The image of her standing there, lonely, frail, and desolate, lingered in his mind. Although she said she didn't need help, Daniel knew that wasn't true. She clearly needed it, and what hurt him the most was her inability or unwillingness to accept it. That night, Daniel lay in bed, tossing and turning, unable to sleep. He kept thinking about Mrs. Catherine, the empty medicine bottles, the messy house, and the dried blood on her clothes. Something was very wrong, but he didn't know what to do. Guilt and anxiety wrapped around him like a dark wave, drowning him in turbulent thoughts. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow I'll go back and check more thoroughly. But Daniel didn't know if tomorrow would be soon enough to help Mrs. Catherine, and that thought weighed on him like lead. Daniel couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Catherine's frail image. He decided he'd come earlier the next morning to check on her. As he arrived, he saw Mrs. Margaret, the neighbor who lived across from Mrs. Catherine's house, standing by the gate. Mrs. Margaret was a woman in her 60s but still spry and always eager to lend a hand. "You're here to deliver mail to Mrs. Catherine again?" Mrs. Margaret asked as she saw Daniel approaching. "Yes, but I noticed she didn't seem well yesterday," Daniel replied, his voice filled with concern. "Do you know if anything's been wrong with her lately?" Mrs. Margaret paused, her expression shifting, with a look of worry evident in her eyes. "Actually, I haven't seen her outside in the past few days either. Normally, Mrs. Catherine is very attentive, always out watering her flowers every morning, but now the flowers are all withered. I was planning to check on her too, but when I knocked, she only said she was fine and didn't need anything." The more Daniel heard, the more worried he became. He decided to knock on her door again. This time, he knocked harder and longer, hoping she would open the door and let him in. After a moment of waiting, the door slowly opened, and Mrs. Catherine appeared, looking just as frail as she had the day before. "Mrs. Catherine, I came to check on you. You didn't seem well yesterday, and this morning I didn't see you come outside. Do you need any help?" Daniel tried to keep his tone gentle, but his concern was obvious. "I'm fine, Daniel. No need to trouble yourself," she replied weakly, her voice trembling. She avoided looking into Daniel's eyes, as if she didn't want anyone to see her helplessness. "Mrs. Margaret is worried about you too," Daniel said, glancing at Mrs. Margaret, who stood beside him. "We just want to make sure you're truly okay." Mrs. Catherine turned to look at Mrs. Margaret, her tired, shadowed eyes filled with sadness. "Thank you, Margaret. But really, I'm fine." Mrs. Margaret stepped closer, trying to take her hand, but Mrs. Catherine gently pulled it away. "Catherine, don't be so stubborn. You don't look well at all. You know that if anything happens, we're here to help you." Daniel could feel the turmoil in Mrs. Catherine's gaze. She wanted to accept help, but she still tried to hold on to the last bit of her dignity. I'm just a little tired. I haven't been able to eat much these past few days. But I'll be okay." "That's not enough, you need to let us help you," Daniel insisted, his eyes pleading. "I can call a doctor for you or help you with some things around the house. Just let us know, and we'll be here." Mrs. Catherine fell silent, as if wrestling with the choice between refusing and accepting help. She lowered her head, her voice barely audible. "Daniel. Margaret. I know you're worried about me. But I don't want to bother anyone. I can manage." "You don't have to manage alone, Mrs. Catherine," Margaret said gently. "Don't let pride push you into an even harder situation. If you don't take care of yourself, things will only get worse." But Mrs. Catherine didn't change her mind. "I know you're all very kind to me. But I really don't want to be a burden. I just need some time to recover." Daniel looked at her, his heart heavy. She was so weak and alone. He could see the pain in her every movement. But her pride, her sense of dignity, seemed to be pushing away any offer of help. He and Margaret were left standing there, helpless, as she turned down the support she so clearly needed. Before he left, Daniel gathered his courage and said, "Mrs. Catherine, if you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to call me. I'm always here to help." Mrs. Catherine nodded faintly, her eyes filling with tears as though she wanted to say something but held back. The door slowly closed before Daniel and Margaret. They stood there for a few moments, looking at each other with worried expressions. "I fear she won't make it," Margaret whispered, her voice heavy with concern. Daniel didn't reply, but his eyes said it all. He couldn't bear the thought of Mrs. Catherine, once so full of life, now wasting away in solitude and suffering. After leaving, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about her situation. He promised himself that he would come back the next day, but this time, he wouldn't let her refuse help. He would call a doctor or try to reach any family she had. Daniel knew that Mrs. Catherine couldn't handle this alone in her current state. The next day, Daniel once again stood in front of her door, his heart heavy with memories of her recent appearances. She looked weak, worn out, and clearly needed help, but she kept trying to hide her exhaustion. Today, Daniel was determined to do something. He couldn't let her slip further into danger. When Daniel knocked on the door, there was no answer. This was unusual. Mrs. Catherine, no matter how weak, would always try to open the door. Daniel knocked louder, his anxiety rising. At that moment, Mrs. Rose, another neighbor, arrived with a bag of food. She saw Daniel at the door and asked, "Daniel, have you seen Mrs. Catherine today? I came to bring her food, but there's no response." Daniel shook his head, his eyes full of worry. "No, Mrs. Rose. I've been knocking, but no one's answering. She might be asleep," Mrs. Rose suggested, but her tone couldn't hide her own concern. "I don't think so. Something feels very wrong. Mrs. Catherine never leaves anyone waiting like this," Daniel replied, his unease growing stronger. Deciding he couldn't wait any longer, Daniel turned the doorknob and found it was unlocked. "Mrs. Rose, I'm going to go in. She might need help." "Go ahead, Daniel. We have to make sure she's okay," Mrs. Rose agreed immediately. Daniel gently opened the door and stepped inside, his heart pounding. Inside, the air was stifling and dark. The house looked even more chaotic than the last time he saw it. Trash was scattered everywhere, and broken items lay across the floor. What shocked them both was the sight of Mrs. Catherine lying unconscious on the floor, beside an overturned chair. "Mrs. Catherine!" Daniel shouted, rushing to her. Mrs. Rose also ran over, panicked. "Mrs. Catherine! Wake up!" Daniel patted her face gently, but she didn't respond. Her face was pale, her eyes closed, her breathing faint. "Mrs. Rose, call an ambulance now. She's not waking up," Daniel shouted, his hands trembling as he checked her pulse. Mrs. Rose fumbled with her phone, dialing emergency services. "Help! We need an ambulance right away. There's an elderly woman unconscious, struggling to breathe." Mrs. Rose spoke quickly into the phone, her voice shaking with fear. While they waited, Daniel tried to stay calm, but his heart was racing. He leaned down to check more closely, noticing that her breathing was getting weaker. "Mrs. Catherine, you have to wake up. We're not going to leave you alone," Daniel said, his voice a mix of worry and despair. The house was silent, except for Mrs. Rose's anxious breathing and Daniel's fast-beating heart. Time seemed to slow, each second feeling like an hour. Finally, the sound of an ambulance siren could be heard in the distance, growing closer. The door burst open, and two paramedics rushed in with a stretcher and equipment. One of them, John, quickly knelt beside Mrs. Catherine and began checking her pulse, while the other prepared the oxygen mask. "She's severely dehydrated and showing signs of malnutrition," John said to his partner. "Get the oxygen ready." Daniel and Mrs. Rose stood by, holding their breath. "Will she be okay?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. John looked up at Daniel, his expression serious. "We'll do everything we can. But this is a critical situation. You did the right thing by calling for help." The stretcher was brought in, and Mrs. Catherine was quickly placed on it, connected to a ventilator. Daniel followed them to the door, watching as the paramedics wheeled her out to the ambulance. Mrs. Rose turned to Daniel, still visibly shaken. "Daniel, if you hadn't come to check on her today, who knows what might have happened. Thank goodness you were there in time." Daniel nodded, but he only felt the weight of worry. "I just hope she'll be all right. We've left her alone for too long. Mrs. Catherine is a strong woman, but no one can take care of themselves forever. This time, she truly needs help," Mrs. Rose replied, her eyes filling with tears. Daniel watched the ambulance drive away, his heart heavy. He knew they'd done the right thing, but he couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. The image of Mrs. Catherine lying unconscious on the floor would haunt him forever. "We'll go to the hospital," Daniel said firmly. "I'm not letting her go through this alone." Mrs. Rose agreed, and they decided to follow the ambulance. As they made their way to the hospital, a vague fear hung in the air. Would they get there in time? And could Mrs. Catherine survive this ordeal? Daniel and Mrs. Rose arrived at the hospital, the tension still thick around the emergency room. Doctors and nurses moved with purpose, their faces reflecting the seriousness of the situation. Daniel stood outside, his heart heavy, his eyes glued to the doors of the emergency room. Dr. Matthews stepped out, his face weary but determined. He looked at Daniel and Mrs. Rose, then spoke quickly. "Mrs. Catherine's condition is very critical. We're doing everything we can to stabilize her blood pressure and heart rate." "Will she make it, doctor?" Mrs. Rose asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Matthews sighed. "I don't want to make any predictions at this point. But she needs strong support to keep her body stable. We're concerned her heart may not withstand the strain." Hearing this, Daniel felt his heart twist. He couldn't bear the thought of this strong, warm-hearted woman fading away. "Is there anything we can do to help her, doctor?" he asked, his voice pleading. "The best thing you can do is stay here, encourage her, and be prepared for any outcome," Dr. Matthew replied before heading back into the room to continue working. Clara, the nurse who had been overseeing Mrs. Catherine's condition from the start, came over to Daniel and Mrs. Rose. "I've been monitoring her since she was brought in. She's very weak, but we're not giving up. We've administered more fluids and medication, but if her heart doesn't stabilize, we may need to perform defibrillation." "Defibrillation? Is that dangerous?" Mrs. Rose asked anxiously. "It does carry risks, but if we don't do it, she won't survive," Clara said, her expression serious. "We're doing everything we can, but if you'd like to see her before we proceed, I'll arrange for you to go in." Daniel looked at Mrs. Rose, his eyes red. "We should go in and see her, shouldn't we?" Mrs. Rose nodded, gripping Daniel's hand. "Yes, Daniel. She needs to know we're here, that she doesn't have to face this alone." Clara led them into the room, where Mrs. Catherine lay motionless on the bed, surrounded by machines and IVs. The steady beep of the heart monitor occasionally skipped, making Daniel and Mrs. Rose tense up each time. Daniel approached her, taking her frail hand, feeling her cold skin. "Mrs. Catherine, it's Daniel. I came to see you. You need to stay strong, do you hear me?" His voice broke, but he tried to stay calm. Mrs. Rose stood beside him, her gaze gentle and full of compassion. "Catherine, you've been strong for so many years. You've overcome greater challenges than this. Now, you need to fight one more time, for us, for Daniel, and for yourself." Mrs. Catherine's eyes fluttered open, weak and unfocused. She saw Daniel and Mrs. Rose, her lips trembling as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the strength. Clara adjusted the ventilator and leaned down, speaking gently to her. "Mrs. Catherine, everyone's here for you. You're not alone." With great effort, Mrs. Catherine moved her lips, her faint voice barely audible. "Daniel. Rose. I'm sorry." "No, you don't have anything to apologize for," Daniel said quickly, tears starting to roll down his cheeks. "You didn't do anything wrong. You just need to stay strong, do you understand?" Mrs. Rose also leaned down, gently holding her other hand. "Catherine, you've been part of our lives for so long. You can't give up so easily." Clara checked the time, then looked at Dr. Matthew, who was preparing the defibrillator nearby. "We're about to begin," she said to Daniel and Mrs. Rose. "You can stay, but please stay calm. We need to focus." Daniel and Mrs. Rose stepped back but kept their eyes fixed on Mrs. Catherine. At Dr. Matthew's signal, Clara placed the defibrillator pads on Mrs. Catherine's chest. "Ready. 1, 2, 3. A light shock rippled through Mrs. Catherine's body, making her jolt slightly. The heart monitor spiked briefly, then dropped again. Clara glanced at Dr. Matthew, her face filled with concern. No stable response. Let's go again. Dr. Matthew ordered, his voice tense. Increase the intensity. Daniel held his breath, clutching Mrs. Rose's hand. This time, the shock was stronger. Mrs. Catherine's body jolted again, and the heartbeat on the monitor rose slightly. Everyone in the room held their breath, watching for any sign. A long silence filled the room, then the heartbeat slowly steadied. Daniel exhaled, as if he himself had been saved from a nightmare. She's going to be okay, right? Clara smiled and nodded gently. Her heart rate is stabilizing. But she'll still need time to recover. This is just the first step. Daniel felt an enormous weight lift from his shoulders, but he knew the battle wasn't over yet. Thank you, doctors. Thank you for not giving up on her, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. Dr. Matthew turned to Daniel, offering a tired but warm smile. You're welcome, son. Mrs. Catherine's condition was very serious when she came in. We had to stabilize her heart and quickly administer fluids to save her from severe dehydration. But Daniel, you did the right thing. Because of your timely action, she now has a chance to survive. Had you delayed any longer, the outcome might have been different. Daniel felt a mix of relief and emotion. I couldn't stand to see her like that. I didn't know if it was the right choice, but I had to try. And you made the right choice, Daniel, Dr. Matthew affirmed, his voice full of appreciation. Many people choose not to intervene, thinking the elderly don't want to be bothered, but you were brave enough to cross that boundary to help her. Mrs. Rose, standing beside him, smiled at Daniel. You saved her, Daniel. Don't doubt that. As the conversation continued, a young nurse named Laura approached. Dr. Matthew, we need to confirm the medication orders for the patient in room 103, she said, then turned to Daniel and Mrs. Rose with an encouraging smile. I heard you saved a life today. Not everyone has the courage to do that. Daniel blushed, shyly looking down. I just did what I felt was right. Dr. Matthew patted Daniel on the shoulder, then continued. I know you're worried about Mrs. Catherine, but she'll need time to recover. Right now, we're giving her fluids and adjusting her nutrition to help her regain strength. You might want to go in and see her for a bit. Daniel nodded firmly. Yes, I'd like to see her. As long as she's all right, I'll do whatever it takes. Dr. Matthew led them into the hospital room where Mrs. Catherine was resting. The room was quiet, with only the steady sounds of the medical equipment. She still looked weak, but her complexion was noticeably better than the last time Daniel had seen her. He felt a surge of emotion as he gazed at her lying in bed, seeming smaller and more fragile than ever. Mrs. Rose stepped to the bedside, gently holding Mrs. Catherine's frail hand. Catherine, can you hear us? We're here, Daniel and I, she said, her voice full of tenderness. Mrs. Catherine's eyes fluttered, struggling to open and focus on the familiar faces around her. Daniel. Rose. I'm sorry for worrying everyone, she whispered, her voice faint. There's nothing for you to apologize for, Daniel replied quickly, fighting back his emotions. We just wanted to make sure you were okay. Nurse Laura approached, checking the machines, and said softly. Mrs. Catherine, you've been through a tough time. But now you're safe. Daniel got you here in time, and everyone is taking care of you. Mrs. Catherine lightly squeezed Daniel's hand, her eyes brimming with tears. Thank you, Daniel. Without you, I don't know what would have happened. Daniel smiled, his gaze softening. Mrs. Catherine, you've always been kind to me. Don't say you're a burden. I'm just glad I could do something for you. At that moment, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair entered the room. He was Mr. Albert, an old friend of Mrs. Catherine's, whom Mrs. Rose had called upon hearing of her hospitalization. Catherine, you know I wouldn't let you face this alone, right? Mr. Albert said, his voice deep and warm. Mrs. Catherine looked at him, a faint smile appearing on her lips. Albert, it's been so long. Long enough for me to feel awful about not being here sooner, Mr. Albert replied, stepping closer and gently placing a hand on her shoulder. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving. Dr. Matthew smiled as he watched the scene unfold. Having good friends like this is one of the greatest supports for recovery. Mrs. Catherine, you're not alone anymore. The whole neighborhood is waiting for you to get better. Nurse Laura added. You need to eat well and rest to regain your strength. We'll monitor your condition closely, but the most important thing is for you to stay positive. The presence of everyone here will help you get through this. Daniel sat beside the bed, holding her hand, feeling both her weakness and the life slowly returning to her. Mrs. Catherine, I'll keep visiting you. And I'm sure Mrs. Rose, Mr. Albert, and everyone else will too. You don't have to do everything alone. Mrs. Catherine looked at Daniel, then at the friends surrounding her. I've always thought I could manage on my own, but clearly, I was wrong. Thank you all. Thank you for not abandoning me. Mrs. Rose smiled, her eyes filled with tenderness. Catherine, we're family. And family doesn't abandon each other in tough times. You just rest and get better, because we have so much more to share with each other. Dr. Matthew looked at Daniel and Mrs. Catherine, feeling satisfied with what he had witnessed. Daniel, I want to emphasize that you did something remarkable today. Getting her to the hospital in time made the difference between life and death. We, and Mrs. Catherine, are all grateful to you. Daniel felt his heart lighten, though he knew her fight wasn't over. Thank you, doctor. I just did what I thought was right. And I'll keep doing it until Mrs. Catherine is fully recovered. The small hospital room was filled with warmth, no longer shrouded in the dark silence of worry. Though there were challenges ahead, Daniel knew they had overcome the hardest part, thanks to the unity, love, and kindness of those around her. After her discharge, Mrs. Catherine was brought home with the help of Daniel and Mrs. Rose. Although her health had improved, she was still very weak, requiring medication and care. Her small home was no longer as quiet as before, as Daniel had decided to visit regularly and help her with many things around the house. One afternoon, when Daniel arrived with a bag of food, he found Mrs. Catherine sitting by the window, gazing absently at her garden. The flowers, which Daniel had worked to revive, were now blooming vibrantly in the late afternoon sun. Mrs. Catherine, I brought you some hot chicken soup. Would you like to have some? Daniel said as he entered, speaking softly as if not to disturb the peaceful atmosphere. Mrs. Catherine turned her head and gave a gentle smile. Daniel, you're here again. I really don't know how to thank you enough. There's no need to be formal, Mrs. Catherine. I'm here because you need help, and I'm happy to do it, Daniel replied, his eyes shining with joy. He placed the soup bowl on the table and gently helped her into a chair. Mrs. Catherine looked at Daniel with affection in her eyes. You're so kind, Daniel. I remember seeing you deliver mail in this neighborhood, and now you've become so close to me. Life is strange, isn't it? Daniel chuckled and shrugged. I suppose it is. I never thought I'd spend so much time with you, but now, I feel like you're a part of my family. Hearing that, Mrs. Catherine blinked, emotions welling up in her eyes. Family, you're right. I got so used to handling everything alone. But now I realize that no one can do everything by themselves. The next day, Daniel brought along a hoe and pruning shears to start tending to the garden that had once been Mrs. Catherine's pride. He carefully pulled weeds, trimmed the branches, and tidied every corner. The smell of earth mingled with the fragrance of flowers, making everything feel more pleasant than ever. Mrs. Catherine sat on a wooden chair nearby, observing Daniel's every move. This is the first time I've seen the garden look this beautiful since I fell ill, she said, her voice tinged with emotion. You know, This garden has been my greatest joy since my husband passed. You've made me feel like I'm young again." Daniel paused, looking up at her. "Then you need to get well soon, so you can take care of the garden yourself. I'm just helping to keep it beautiful for you." "Thank you, Daniel. I'll do my best," Mrs. Catherine replied, a glint of determination in her eyes. One morning, as Daniel was trimming the rose bushes, he saw a taxi pull up in front of Mrs. Catherine's gate. The door opened, and a young woman stepped out. She wore a long white dress, her dark hair smooth, her face beautiful but with a hint of worry. Daniel straightened up, not yet saying anything, when the young woman looked at him and smiled softly. "Hello, I'm Sophia. I'm Mrs. Catherine's granddaughter," she said, her voice gentle yet clear. Daniel was taken aback, his eyes widening. "You're Sophia? The one who often writes letters to Mrs. Catherine?" Sophia nodded, her eyes showing a hint of sadness. "Yes. I just found out about her hospitalization from a friend here, so I rushed back. I didn't expect her condition to be this bad." Daniel stayed silent, unsure what to say, then led Sophia into the house where Mrs. Catherine was resting. When she saw her granddaughter standing before her, Mrs. Catherine looked as if she couldn't believe her eyes. "Sophia, is that really you?" Her voice trembled with surprise. "Yes, Grandma, it's me. I'm sorry I couldn't come sooner," Sophia said, moving close to her grandmother, kneeling and taking her hand. "When I heard you were sick, I knew I had to come back right away." "You're really here," Mrs. Catherine whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She reached out, gently caressing Sophia's cheek, feeling the warmth of her granddaughter's small hand. "For years, I dreamed of seeing you every time I got a letter. But I never imagined our reunion would happen like this." Sophia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Don't say that, Grandma. You've always been so strong. I know you'll get through this." Daniel stood nearby, feeling the deep emotion that filled the room. He could clearly see the bond between grandmother and granddaughter, the love and longing that had been bridged through these moments of tears. Since Sophia's return, the atmosphere in Mrs. Catherine's house had transformed. Sophia cared for her meticulously, cooking her favorite dishes and sitting by the window with her, sharing stories. Daniel continued to visit daily, helping with household chores and the garden, and together, he and Sophia created a warm, supportive environment for Mrs. Catherine. One time, as the three of them sat together in the garden, Sophia looked over at Daniel, her eyes full of gratitude. "Daniel, you've taken such good care of my grandmother while I wasn't here. I don't know how to thank you enough." "Sophia, you don't need to thank me. I care deeply about Mrs. Catherine, and I only wanted to help," Daniel replied, his face turning slightly red with embarrassment. Mrs. Catherine smiled, her gaze gentle as she looked at both of them. "Daniel, you know, I feel so grateful to have you by my side during this difficult time. And Sophia, having you back is the greatest gift of all. I feel like the luckiest person in the world." "No, Grandma. I'm the lucky one," Sophia said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "I've realized that nothing is more important than family. You've been my whole world since I was a child. Even though we were apart, I always felt your love in every line of your letters." Daniel watched the two of them, feeling the warmth and sacredness of their love. He knew he was witnessing something special, a bond that neither time nor distance could break. As night fell, Daniel prepared to leave, and Sophia walked him to the gate. "Daniel, could you keep coming by? I want us to take care of my grandmother together, so she never feels alone again." Daniel turned back, smiling with resolve. "Of course, Sophia. I'll always be here, whenever she needs me. Because Mrs. Catherine has become family to me too." Sophia smiled, her heart filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for being here when my grandmother needed it most." They stood by the gate, looking at the garden bathed in the gentle glow of golden lights. Both understood that love wasn't just in words but in meaningful, small acts. The flowers in the garden seemed to witness this, blooming brighter, celebrating the bond that had rescued a lonely heart. Time passed, with winter quietly giving way to the warm rays of spring. Mrs. Catherine's house had changed so much, it was no longer a gloomy, lonely place like when Daniel first knocked on her door. Each day, the small garden in front of her house blossomed vibrantly, as if it, along with Daniel, Sophia, and Mrs. Rose, was helping Mrs. Catherine regain her spirit and vitality. Daniel still visited regularly, not to deliver mail but to care for Mrs. Catherine and work alongside Sophia in the garden. The entire neighborhood knew of Daniel's dedication, and when people spoke of him, they often called him Mrs. Catherine's guardian angel. The praise often made him blush, but it also filled him with happiness. One afternoon, as Sophia was watering the plants, Mrs. Rose came by. "Are you tending to the flowers for Mrs. Catherine again, Sophia?" Mrs. Rose smiled, her gaze full of warmth. "Yes, ma'am. Daniel is on his way, so I wanted the garden to look nice," Sophia replied, smiling as she thought of the first time she'd met him. "He's always working so hard, it makes me want to do something to help too." Mrs. Rose nodded, her expression tender. "I can see that clearly. You know, Sophia, Daniel is a rare young man. Hardworking, kind, and always thinking of others. I've never seen anyone spend as much time and care for Mrs. Catherine as he has." Sophia blushed slightly, her eyes shining. "I know. Daniel always does more than he has to. Without him, I wouldn't know how to handle things when my grandmother got sick." Just then, Daniel appeared with a bright smile on his face. "Hello, Mrs. Rose, hello, Sophia." He held a bag of treats. "I brought some sweets for Mrs. Catherine. I think she'll like them." "Daniel, you're so thoughtful," Mrs. Rose said, then leaned toward Sophia and whispered. "Don't let a young man like him slip away." Sophia could only smile softly, but Mrs. Rose's words echoed in her heart. She realized that since Daniel's arrival, both her grandmother's and her own life had changed. Previously, Sophia had always thought of herself as strong and capable of taking care of her grandmother alone, but now she felt truly grateful for Daniel's presence, sharing those burdens. That evening, after helping Sophia tidy up the kitchen, they sat together in the garden, where a gentle breeze blew and the moonlight cast a soft glow over the flower beds. Sophia looked at Daniel, her eyes thoughtful. "Daniel, do you ever feel tired? Coming here every day, helping my grandmother, tending to the garden, don't you ever feel it's too much?" Daniel looked at her in surprise, then chuckled softly. "Why would it be a burden? Helping Mrs. Catherine and being here with everyone is what makes me happiest. Besides, I feel like, this is my family." Sophia gazed into Daniel's clear, bright eyes, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. "You always say things that make people feel at ease. But honestly, without you, I don't know what I would have done." Daniel shrugged, his gaze sincere. "I'm just doing what I think is right. When I saw Mrs. Catherine struggling, I knew I couldn't just stand by. And Sophia, you're very strong. I've never seen anyone so dedicated to their family." Sophia smiled softly, warmth filling her heart. "Maybe I'm not as strong as you think. There are times when I feel tired and helpless. But every time that happens, seeing you makes me feel like I have the strength to carry on." Daniel stayed silent, watching Sophia, as if there was something he wanted to say but couldn't bring himself to. I'm just glad to be here with everyone," he finally replied, his voice gentle. Another time, as Daniel was replanting some wilting flowers, Mrs. Catherine sat nearby, watching him with affectionate eyes. "Daniel, I don't know how to thank you. Since you came, I feel like I've been given a new lease on life. You've made this home warmer than ever." Daniel looked up, smiling. "Please don't say that, Mrs. Catherine. I'm only doing this to make sure you feel happy and get well." Turning to Sophia, Mrs. Catherine whispered. Sophia, you know, Daniel is a gift sent to us from above. Sophia nodded, but something unspoken lingered in her heart. Over these past days, she had observed Daniel's every move and gesture. The way he cared for her grandmother, tended to each flower with such gentleness, and the warmth in his smile whenever he looked at her. Everything about Daniel made her feel close to him, a strange sense of peace. That night, Sophia couldn't sleep. She went out to sit in the garden, her gaze lost in the sight of the flowers blooming under the moonlight. After a while, she heard familiar footsteps. Daniel approached, sitting beside her and gently asking. "Why aren't you asleep, Sophia? Is something bothering you?" Sophia turned to look at him, her eyes shimmering with emotions she hadn't yet expressed. "No, I'm just thinking about everything." Daniel stayed quiet, waiting for her to continue. "Daniel, you know, I used to be so afraid of losing my grandmother. But you were here, doing everything to help her, to help me. And I realize that you've become an important part of my life, more than I ever expected." Her words took Daniel by surprise, but he couldn't look away from her. "Sophia, you. I know this may sound sudden, but Daniel, I'm so grateful to you, and more than that. I think I've fallen for you," Sophia said, her voice trembling with emotion. Daniel was stunned, hardly believing his ears. He had always cherished his bond with Mrs. Catherine's family, but he had never expected Sophia to feel this way. "Sophia. I feel the same. I hadn't dared admit it, but every day here, with you and Mrs. Catherine, I've felt like I found a family. And I think I fell in love with you somewhere along the way." Tears rolled down Sophia's cheeks, but they were tears of happiness. "Daniel, I don't know what to say. But thank you for being here and bringing us the warmth that you have." Gently, Daniel took Sophia's hand, feeling its soft warmth in his. "Sophia, if you'll allow me, I'll keep being here, caring for Mrs. Catherine, caring for you, like my own family. Because I truly love you." Under the moonlight, they sat beside each other, saying nothing more, but their bond needed no words to be expressed. The garden that night seemed to witness not only the blooming of flowers but also the budding of a gentle, warm love, as delicate as the moonlight illuminating the world. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to them, Mrs. Catherine had overheard their conversation. She felt a warm current flow through her aging heart. How long had it been since she had felt such a strong connection? Memories of those difficult days came flooding back. She remembered the moment of despair when she lay helpless on the floor, unable to get up, and then seeing Daniel rush in, his concerned eyes bright, as if saying, "I won't let you be alone." For the first time in years, she had felt genuine, selfless care from someone outside of her family. "Daniel, you were there for me when I needed someone most," she whispered in her heart. "If it weren't for you, I might not be sitting here now, feeling the fullness of life." Her warm, peaceful feelings didn't stop at Daniel. She thought about Sophia, her beloved granddaughter who had flown halfway across the world to be by her side. Sophia's letters had once been her only joy each day, tiny rays of light in her dark life, but she had never dared hope that Sophia would actually return. "Sophia, you've shown me that no matter the distance, family love is an unbreakable bond." Mrs. Catherine smiled faintly, recalling the first time Sophia had returned. Her granddaughter, now a grown woman, still carried the same gentleness as in the letters she had read over and over. "You came back, and you didn't abandon me. You have no idea how much that means, Sophia." Her mind then turned to the friends around her, especially Mrs. Rose, her dear neighbor who had always come by to check on her, even when she stubbornly refused help. "Rose, I don't know what I would have done without you. I tried to be strong, but the truth is, I couldn't do it alone. You were there, patient and steady, even without any thanks." Thinking of all the times Rose had brought food, knocked lightly on her door, and smiled warmly when she answered, Mrs. Catherine's heart filled with gratitude. I may not have told you, but your presence has carried me through the darkest moments. The voices outside grew softer, almost like whispers to each other. Sophia and Daniel sat there, not saying much, yet their silence was full of unspoken emotions. They didn't need words to express their feelings, for their care and sincerity spoke volumes. I see Sophia's gentleness in the way she looks at Daniel, and I see the joy in Daniel's eyes whenever he looks at her. They've found each other, and that's the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed. Mrs. Catherine slowly closed her eyes, but her thoughts remained vivid. Thank you, life, for bringing such wonderful people into my world. Daniel, you've given me hope and shown me that kindness still exists. Sophia, you've proven that family bonds don't weaken with distance. And Rose, you've shown me that I am never alone, even in the hardest times. Thank you, Daniel, for being here, for becoming part of this family. You didn't leave when things got hard, instead, you came closer, helping me through it all. Her voice was a soft whisper, as if her words were floating on the wind, carrying them to Daniel. Thank you, Sophia, for not forgetting me, for coming back and letting me feel the love of family once more. I always dreamed of seeing you again, and it's a miracle that it came true. Thank you, Rose, for never giving up on me, for always being there, quietly but steadfastly. Friends like you are truly the greatest treasures in life. Mrs. Catherine felt a profound lightness, as if all her burdens and sorrows had melted away in that moment. She knew that not everyone was as blessed to be surrounded by love, and that made her feel incredibly grateful. I once feared I would pass away alone, but you have shown me that love and true care can conquer everything. You are my family, everything I could ever need. She turned her gaze to the window, seeing the soft moonlight illuminating the garden, making the flowers glow even more beautifully. Daniel and Sophia still sat together, their hands gently touching, as if they'd found an anchor after all the storms. You two make a lovely pair, she thought to herself. Keep loving each other like this, and you'll overcome any hardships that life brings. That night, Mrs. Catherine drifted into the most peaceful sleep she'd had in a long time. In her dreams, she found herself standing in a garden full of flowers, surrounded by familiar faces. Daniel, Sophia, Rose, and other friends from the neighborhood. They laughed together, cared for the flowers, creating a beautiful tableau of love and gratitude. Thank you all for giving me the feeling of being alive, of being loved and cherished. Her final words echoed like a gentle song, lingering softly in the night. Though life still held challenges ahead, she knew that with her loved ones by her side, she had gained the most precious gift. And that was the gift life had given her, one that couldn't be measured by words alone.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.